Today we're going to talk about tips and tricks for advanced rubber dam isolation. Our objectives for today, we were going to help you identify the clamps needed for complex restorative procedures. We are together going to understand why and when should they be used. We're going to help you identify the materials needed to modify the clamps. And we're going to help you understand when a modified 212 clamp should be used. We do want to thank the financial support that we have received from the companies that you see here on our slide, from Oral Arts Dental Laboratories, Colteen, Comet, B&R Dental. Thanks to their support, we are able to give you one free CE credit that will be provided for this webinar. And the way that you access the quiz for the webinar is by visiting our webpage, www.romerodentalseminars.com. Once you are in our webpage, please click on webinars and you will find three very important links. Link number one is the live webinar link where you are able to sign up for our future webinars. Again, we all know that there's the seated is limited, so please go ahead and check out that link and you can go ahead and sign up for future webinars. We have a link for our on-demand webinars. If you are not able to be part of our live webinars, you can always go to this link, and here you will find a library with all our previous webinars that have been recorded and uploaded to our site. And finally, you have our CE quizzes link, which is what you're seeing here on the right-hand side of my screen. For last week, part one of rubber dam isolation, we had a quiz that you are more than welcome to complete once you watch the video, and you can email it to us. And today we have rubber dam part two, which is the new quiz that we've created for today's webinar. Please go in, download, answer the questions, fill all the personal information that we need from you, and then just go ahead and email it to us at romerodentalseminars@gmail.com. So please make sure that you take advantage of this, and we will be more than happy to give you that one CE credit offered by us, and thanks to our sponsors. So the first question I want to help answer today is, can we use our universal clamps for complex restorative procedures? As we can all remember, last week we were talking about these universal clamps, and we said that the universal clamps that we like to use are normally the W3, the W2, and the W8A. And the question that I have for you today is, can we use these clamps for more complex restorative procedures? And the answer to that question is yes. We're not going to be able to use them for every single procedure, but there will be some procedures that we will find these clamps to be useful in. And I'm sharing here with you one case where I'm getting ready to deliver a gold crown. And you can see that by using the W3, and because my margins were at the gingival margin, my preparation margins were located at the gingival margin, I was able to use a W3 clamp and engage all 4 points and stabilize the clamp around this prepared molar. Now, one thing that I do want to show you, that I do want you to see in my photo, is that I've had the need to use some Teflon tape, a little bit of block out resin to kind of stabilize and keep the area or the field dry prior for me to bonding or cementing, in this particular case, cementing my restoration. Another thing that you have to understand is that when we are doing these type of procedures, and this is exactly the same case, and you can see how nice and dry the field is prior me cementing my restoration, I want you to see that, and I did explain this last week, the use of the W2 clamp in the opposite side of the arch in order for me to liberate or eliminate the tension around this W3 clamp. So one of the things that you're going to have to do is that you're going to have to use most likely two clamps in order for you to be able to do a procedure like this using a W3 clamp. But again, this is something that clinically can be used. And as you can see, in many clinical situations, you will be able to use just your regular universal clamps to do a little bit more complex restorative procedures. Now, the thing is that, we are going to need for sure the use of other clamps for more complicated, complicated restorative procedures. So which other clamps are useful when we're talking about complex restorative procedures. And I want to share with you these two clamps today. These are two clamps that I would highly recommend that you have in your armamentarium if you are a dentist that is, daily restoring you're in a daily basis, you're restoring teeth, and you're confronted with many difficult clinical situations. The first one that I want to talk about is the W00 clamp. And I want you to look at this clamp because I'm going to compare this clamp to my B4 clamp, which is another very useful clamp. But I want you to look at the differences between these two clamps. And the number one difference, I want you to look at the thickness of the bow, the metal bow that you see that actually joins both of the jaws of the clamp. You can see that this bow is not only thicker than the B4 clamp, but the distance between the left and right side of the bow is narrower than the distance between the left and right side of the bow on the B4 clamp, which tells me immediately that this is a retentive clamp. So I'm going to be able to use this clamp as a standalone clamp to retain and to retract my rubber dam. So this clamp really rarely needs some added stabilization. Now, that being said, I want you to keep in mind the word rarely, because you will find some clinical situations where you're going to need to add some either compound or block out resin to stabilize the W00 clamp. But again, the W00 and the B4 are great clamps, and they should be part of our armamentarium if we are doing, restorative dentistry day in and day out. So first, I'm going to start talking about the features of the W00 clamp. And as you can see, this clamp has its beaks on both of the jaws. It's a wingless clamp, and that's why the W is here. So, and they do make this clamp as a 00 clamp with wings. But again, I did explain to you last week that the benefit of having a wingless clamp is obviously having more room for other features or other materials that we're going to need, bands or sectional matrices that we're going to need to use in order for us to restore it to. So we need that added space. And without, by eliminating the wings, you get that added space. But what I want you to see here is that this is a very nice, it's a very small clamp. So it's suited for either, premolars or anterior teeth. The other thing is that it has very nice and uniform and sharp beaks, and it has these 4 points that are going to help you stabilize this clamp. And this is what makes this clamp a retentive clamp. So if we were to eliminate these beaks, it would be more like a B4 clamp, which is a retraction clamp and not a retentive clamp. So those are, key features that make that actually tell you, or make the differences between one clamp and the other. So here you can see I have in a dentiform, I have sectioned, I have eliminated almost the entire crown for this premolar. And I want you to see how easily this clamp not only is able to contact and stabilize itself around a broken down or fractured tooth like the one I have mimicking here in this dentiform, but most importantly, the way that it pushes the rubber dam apically. So with this clamp, you not only get stabilization and retentive features, but you do get some added retraction features in one clamp. So this is a very versatile clamp that you can again add to your armamentarium. And just to show you some clinical applications, in this particular case, I am using, you see here, there's a W8A clamp placed on this molar. I'm using this clamp as my main retentive clamp. Now, even though I'm using a W00 here on the tooth where I'm going to deliver a crown, again, this clamp is self-retained because of the 4 points that it has located in both the buccal and the lingual beaks. Now, because of the type of preparation, and you can see here that my buccal margin is very close to the gingival margin on this tooth. So there's very, very little tooth structure left here that I can hold this clamp to. That's why I added the block out resin to stabilize the clamp. So again, this clamp is self-stabilizing clamp, but sometimes you will need this added stabilization by using either compound or block out resin. And this is a really good example. And again, it all depends on the type of preparation that you have. But what I want you to see is that the way that the clamp, because of the width of the beaks, the width between both points of the beaks, the mesial and the distal points of these beaks, they're narrow enough that they are, you can push not only the rubber dam and the tissue away from the margins like you're seeing here on the buccal side, but this width is very nice and suitable for you to deliver indirect restorations like I'm doing in this particular case. And the thing that I want you to observe is that because of the size and the design of this clamp, there is no interference between the seating of your restoration and the actual beaks of the clamp. So this is, again, a very useful clamp, and I use it a lot for procedures like the one that I'm sharing with you right now for delivering indirect restorations. Now, here's another case. Again, I'm going to work on this tooth over here. And what I want to show you here is that um, not only we are keeping the rubber dam in place with the W00. So in this particular case, Dr. Shepard is using this clamp as a retentive clamp. He is keeping his rubber dam in place thanks to the W00, but he's working on this lateral tooth. He's actually going to build a fiber reinforced resin bridge. He's going to bond a tooth to this crown and to this natural tooth right here. So he's using a modified 212, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But the most important feature here is because this 212 clamp is not a retentive clamp, is a retraction clamp. We always need a retentive clamp to keep our rubber dam in place, to keep everything nice and stable. And this W00 clamp not only helps you retract if needed, but most importantly, it helps you retain your rubber dam in place. So again, this is what makes this clamp very useful in restorative dentistry. So I just want to share with you this particular case. You can see how he was able to isolate the area, keep everything nice and dry, have a very nice working operative field so that he can bond this resin, this fiber reinforced resin tooth to the PFM crown and to the natural existing tooth on the right hand side of the screen. And again, he's using a modified 212 to retract the tissue here to have access to this tooth and to the connector. And at the same time, he's retracting and retaining the rubber dam in place thanks to the W00 on this PFM crown so that he can have good access to the connector on the right hand side of the screen as well. And not only he's got good access to both of the connectors, but you can see that he's been able to finish or complete his restoration by means of using the W00 and the modified 212 clamp. Let me go back once, I'm sorry. So I just want to see you, I want to show you here how he was able to get a burr in the embrasure area and finish the embrasure areas very nicely, and all the procedure done completely under rubber dam isolation just because he chose to he chose to select ideal clamps for this clinical situation. So again, having a good armamentarium, having a good number of clamps, and it will help us for sure be able to incorporate more of our complex restorative procedures, or to be able to perform them under rubber dam isolation. Now, the second clamp that I was sharing with you today that we can incorporate as well is the B4 clamp. And the B stands for Brinker clamps. This is actually a kit that has, if I'm not mistaken, 6 clamps. And one of these clamps is the B4 clamp. And I would say that out of the Brinker clamp system that has all these 6 clamps, the one that you're going to use the most is definitely going to be the B4 clamp and the B6 clamp. But the B4 clamp is the one that I'm talking about today. And I want you to think about this clamp. I want you to look at this photo, and I want you to compare it to the previous clamp that we were reviewing right now, to the W00 clamp. Again, look at the distance between the left and the right side of the bow. You can see how thin the bow is. So this clamp is going to have a lot less tension in the jaw areas or in the beak area. And what I want you to see is that the contact points are barely there. So they're very nice and round. They're not as sharp. The beaks are not as pronounced. So this clamp does not exert force around the gingival aspect of the tooth. So this is not a good clamp to retain your rubber dam, but it's a great clamp to retract your rubber dam and the tissue surrounding the tooth, because this clamp does not have very active contact points. It's a clamp that would rarely damage the tissue around the tooth. And this is the beauty of this clamp, because we all know that if we damage the tissue around a rubber dam, or the tissue that surrounds the tooth around a rubber dam, we are most likely going to get some bleeding through the rubber dam if we don't seal it correctly. And this is going to affect, obviously, the restorative field. Is going to contaminate our restorative field, and it's just going to make our restorative procedure, a little bit more difficult to handle. So I want to share with you just a couple of clinical cases where I think that using a B4 clamp is ideal. And I'm going to show you many clinical situations, because this is a super, I would call it a Superman clamp. It's a very versatile clamp. You can use it in many clinical situations. You can use it in many different positions within the mouth, and in different teeth as well. So this makes this B4 clamp one of my favorite clamps for restorative dentistry. So I'm sharing with you here a case where I'm going to bond a porcelain veneer to this preparation that I've completed on tooth number 9. And I want you to see that you can see that the rubber dam around the rest of the teeth, and I'm not worried about these teeth because I'm not going to restore these teeth whatsoever. But you can see that even though the rubber dam is inverted correctly, most likely the gingival zenith of the tooth is all the way up here. So this rubber dam is literally covering part of the enamel of the tooth. So in this particular tooth, it was going to be exactly the same. What helped me push that rubber dam apically and push the tissue at the same time apically, and put it, separate the rubber dam away from my prosthetic margin, was the B4 clamp. And I want you to see that not only it helps me push the rubber dam apically, but it helps me invaginate the rubber dam interproximally, mesially and distally. So it gives me full access to my restorative margin and to the substrate that I'm going to be bonding to. So not only it gives me access, but at the same time, it gives me room in order for me to apply these mylar strips between the interproximal area, so that I can protect the neighboring teeth from acid etching, and at the same time protect them from the bonding procedure, from the actual placement of the adhesive on the substrate. Once the adhesive is polymerized, I am, you know, I'm one, the adhesive is polymerized, I am okay um, removing the mylar strips and having direct access to my substrate to be able to bond my veneer in place. And you can see here, I have fully seated the porcelain veneer. I'm just getting rid of some of the excess cement. And I want you to see what this looks like immediately after me removing the rubber dam. Yes, there is a little bit of laceration around the tissue, nothing major. We all know that this is going to heal in a couple of days. But the most important aspect of this procedure was that I was able to retract the tissue, to retract the rubber dam, to push the rubber dam interproximally, and to have good access and a clean access to my restorative margin. Let's now take this to another clinical case that is very common in restorative dentistry. And this is these non-caries cervical lesions, or class 5 cervical lesions. And again, I want you to see how difficult this would be if you think about it, how long these teeth are. Every single one has a little bit of a difference in regards to the gingival zenith. And I'm going to have access to those gingival margins, to clean gingival margins, in order for me to be able to bond to this dentin and to this root surface up here in the gingival aspect in the best way possible. So if you think about it, you can see here that I've stabilized. This is a cross arch rubber dam technique. So I have a W00 clamp on the opposite side of the arch, keeping my rubber dam in place. And then I start using my B4 clamp that you can see up here, the B4 clamp. I start using the B4 clamp on the most distal tooth that I need to restore. So this is the second bicuspid. You can see that the first bicuspid and the canine, you can see how the rubber dam is literally invading the operative field. But at this point, I'm not worried about that, because I'm going to restore one tooth at a time. And all I'm doing, in order for me to have good access to the operative field, all I'm going to do is that once I'm done with the second premolar, I'm going to grab the same B4 clamp and I'm going to move it to the canine area. I'm going to restore the canine area, and then I'm going to move. And you can see me already, I've already completed the second bicuspid, and I have moved in this photo, I have moved my B4 clamp to the canine area. You can go ahead and move it to the middle tooth if you want, and then come to the canine. The order doesn't matter. The thing that the take home message of this case for me and for me to share with you today is that using the same B4 clamp, you can just move it to the next tooth. Make sure that you retract the rubber dam. You push the rubber dam apically and sit the clamp on the cervical portion, on the portion of the tooth that you have not prepped, that you're not going to prepare, so that you know that you have that clamp fully seated and you have full access to your restorative margin. And then you go ahead and you do the same to the next tooth. So you're going to move this clamp to 3 different positions. Now, one thing that I want to make clear here, because last week I was referring to the separation, to the distance between each of the perforations, between each tooth that you're going to restore. And we stated that the distance that I want you to use for my basic rubber dam isolation, which is a topic that we discussed last week, was between 5 and 6 millimeters. Well, for the advanced rubber dam isolation, there's a little bit of a difference in regards to the distance. And I want you to think about this, and we're going to think about this together. If I have to apically position or push the rubber dam apically on each of these teeth in order for me to be able to to grasp my clamp, to make the beaks of the clamp sit on the portion of the tooth that has not been prepped, I need to overstretch my rubber dam. So if I keep the same distance between each perforation, between 5 and 6 millimeters, most likely you're going to get some tissue showing through these perforations. So what you need to do is increase the distance between the perforations every time you know you're going to retract the rubber dam. So what I'm doing now is that instead of using 5 to 6 millimeters between perforations, I sometimes go all the way up to 10 millimeters between perforations if I know that the tooth that I'm going to restore is going to need for me to displace or push the rubber dam apically. This will allow the rubber dam to invert itself interproximally without having any tissue retracted. So you can see here, I don't have any tissue showing here. I don't have any tissue showing here. I have a little bit of tissue showing here, which means that the distance between this perforation and this perforation most likely was 5 to 6 millimeters. So just to show you as a good example of something not to do, I should have kept the 10 millimeters even between this lateral incisor and the canine, even though I wasn't going to restore the lateral incisor if I did not want tissue to show. So this is very important. When you're doing advanced rubber dam isolation, you need to increase the distance between your perforations because of the fact that you're going to have to stretch your rubber dam more than you would need to do in a basic rubber compared to a basic rubber dam isolation. So for this patient, you can see that I've now completed all 3 restorations, and I did them all the same day, just moving my B4 clamp from one tooth to the other until I was able to restore all 3 teeth. Now, yes, you can see that I still have some caries interproximally on this premolar, and I'm going to show you the continuation of the case. This is the same patient. Now you can see I know that there's decay interproximal here, and there's some recurrent decay as well on the lingual aspect of that root surface surrounding this very old amalgam restoration. So again, we're going to still use the same B4 clamp. We did change the rubber dam. We're using a new rubber dam now because again, we're this particular tooth, we had to, create a lot of distance between these perforations. You can see now that I've increased the distance between the perforations. There's 10 millimeters between this premolar, and this is what allowed me to push the rubber dam, invert the rubber dam completely around this preparation. And I want you to see how deep this preparation is. Preparation ends right here, but I want you to see how deep it is and how beautifully the rubber dam was inverted within or underneath the tissue, between the tissue and the actual tooth structure, and all thanks to this B4 clamp. And as you can see here, in order for me to stabilize the B4 clamp, I added a little bit of blockout resin, and I attached that blockout resin to the actual rubber dam, the tooth that was right here underneath the rubber dam. So I didn't perforate the tooth, distal tooth. I just attached that to the actual rubber dam, and that helped me keep the rubber dam, the actual B4 clamp in place. This is an occlusal view of exactly the same clinical situation. You can see how deep both the mesial and distal box are for this. This is a fairly complex restorative procedure that we're going to do here. We're going to have to elevate the margin definitely on the distal and the mesial before we go ahead and do our final restoration. And what I want to share with you here, again, how helpful this clamp is clinically, because the clamp has very small beaks or very small jaws. It allows me to first my place, I'm sorry, place my first Toffelmeyer band. And you can see here that I've sectioned this Toffelmeyer band halfway through. So this is 50% of the original width of the band, because all I'm trying to do here is elevate the mesial and the distal margin. So now you can see that I've elevated here the distal. Now here both the mesial and distal were elevated. I have removed this first Toffelmeyer band that I had sectioned in half, and now I'm using a new Toffelmeyer band, a full Toffelmeyer band, so that I can go ahead and restore this tooth completely. So I want you just to walk you through all the clinical steps and all that I am allowed to do by using good, using a good isolation technique and selecting the right clamp. Which would have been a wrong clamp to select here? Well, most likely the B2 clamp. The B2 clamp, the beaks would have been most likely too wide on the lingual. This clamp is more of a retentive clamp. It would not retract or push the rubber dam apically. So this is why it's so important that you know these clamps and that you know when to select them correctly and when to use them clinically, so that you take advantage of all the properties and the benefits that each of these clamps have. Now, another thing that I want you to observe is the floss ligature on this first bicuspid. This floss ligature is helping, because again, you're seeing here that I've only perforated. There's only 4 perforations on this rubber dam. I'm using a wedget to stabilize and to keep my rubber dam in place, but I'm also helping myself keep everything in place with this floss ligature on this first premolar. So again, I'm using many of the things the tips and tricks that I've been sharing with you these past 2 weeks, so that I can be successful in my final restoration. And I want to show you here. This is immediately after removal of the rubber dam. And obviously there's a little bit of tissue irritation here because we use a burr to polish and to get this margin nice and smooth against the tooth. But what I want you to see is that if we were to do this without rubber dam, imagine the amount of, how difficult it would have been for us to control the bleeding around this area while we're performing our operative procedure. On the other hand, by selecting the right clamp and using a right technique, the correct technique in regards to separation of the perforations, using the usage of the floss ligature technique, and securing the rubber dam in place with the wedget, using all these principles have allowed us to have a very nice and clean access and a clean operative procedure throughout until we're completely done with our operative procedure. So this is what I want. This is what I really want to share with you. Now, another benefit of the B4 clamp. This is another clinical situation, and again, these are cases shared by Dr. Shefford, and he's one of our residents. But I want to share with you here, how nice and clean he was able to access these crown margins. If you're going to remove these crowns, if you're going to reprep this tooth, if you're going to restore these teeth, whatever you're going to do with them, I want you to see how this B4 clamp was able to push the gingival margin away from the area that we want to have access to with our burrs. And this has been, we've used here as well Teflon tape. And the reason why we use Teflon tape is because we're going to have our burrs near these areas. This is our operative field. This is the area that we're going to be working around. So if we don't retract our rubber dam using Teflon tape like we did in this particular case, what happens is that your rubber dam is actually going to be sitting on the tooth. And every time you're using a burr around these areas, and I'll show you how to prep teeth under rubber dam isolation in a few more slides. But what I want you to think about right now is that if you were to use a burr right here and your rubber dam was in contact with the actual tooth structure, you're going to lacerate that rubber dam all the time. So you're going to tear your rubber dam because the burr is going to be in contact with it. So every time you want to use a burr, these are subgingival margins. And what we've done here is push the gingival aspect, or the gingival margin, away from the prosthetic margin of these crowns, that you can see they're very inadequate for this particular case. And once we do that, now we have access to this area. And were we able to achieve this? Thanks to the B4 clamp. Now you can see that not only we have used two B4 clamps, one on the right, one on the left, and one on the right hand side, but these B4 clamps are secured and stabilized with block out resin. So again, this is something that you're going to have to do the majority of times when you're using the B4 clamp, because this is a clamp that it doesn't stay stable easily. So it needs that added help, either with compound or with block out resin. And again, just to show you, now he's been able to clean the margins, and you can see that the Teflon is here, the rubber dam is still intact. Why? Because the burr was not in contact with the rubber dam whatsoever. So now that we know that we can use either the W00 or the B4 clamp in many complex clinical situations, I want you to know that there are other clinical situations where these clamps just don't work as well. And, we can all understand, I've shown you many cases of anterior teeth. I've shared with you cases on premolars, but I haven't shared with you any cases on molars. And the reason that I haven't shared with you cases on molar teeth is because the B4 clamp or the W00 to be used on these particular teeth, on molar teeth, is not that easy. Sometimes the beaks are too thin. It's very hard to keep them stable in that clinical situation. So what we do for these clinical situations, and what we recommend doing, is modify a clamp. And the clamp that we have chosen, that we think is the best one to modify in order for us to use it in many clinical situations, is the 212 clamp. Now, I do want to make clear, I do want to disclose that the clamp modification techniques that will be shown in this presentation are the sole responsibility of the presenter. These techniques have been used in clinical dentistry for over 30 years and require training and continued use to master. So once you get a hang of modifying your clamps, all you have to do is start using this technique. And I promise you, the more you use it, the better you will get. Now, if you modify the clamp following the steps that I'm going to share with you today, believe me, this is going to be a lot easier for you to get used to using this clamp and stabilizing this clamp. Please keep in mind that once you modify the 212 clamp, this clamp becomes a retraction clamp. So this clamp will need added stabilization by means of compound or block out resin. This is very important for you to understand. Once you modify this clamp would be in the category of the Brinker clamps, or like the B4 clamp. Is a retraction clamp, and it will need added stability. You will need to use something to add stability to the clamp in many clinical situations. So what is the first step for you to modify the 212 clamp? So the first thing that I want you to know is that you're going to need at least two of these clamps in order for you to fabricate a right modified 212 clamp and a left modified 212 clamp. Now, personally, I can tell you that I have at least 6 or 8 of these clamps modified. And the reason why I have 6 or 8 of these clamps modified is because once you modify them, it doesn't mean that you cannot continue modifying these clamps. And sometimes they are going to require some added modifications based out of the clinical situation and the tooth that you're going to be using this clamp around. But you will get to a point, like in my case right now, that I have 6 to 8 of these clamps already modified, that these 6 to 8 clamps would most likely serve me in at least 99% of the more complex clinical cases that I'm performing today. So now, how long do these clamps last once they're modified? I can tell you that I probably use these clamps in 30 to 40 clinical applications, and you will find yourself that sometimes you don't get them to have enough pressure anymore. I've had a couple of these clamps, over time, maybe after 50 to 60 uses and sterilizing them, obviously weaken and they can fracture. That's why I disclosed at the beginning of this presentation that this is not a technique recommended by any clamp manufacturer. This is a technique that I'm personally recommending you, and again has been used in clinical dentistry for over 30 years. So this clinical technique works, but your clamps are going to have to be replaced, you know, most likely after 40 to 50 clinical applications. Now, that being said, that's a lot of teeth restored before you go ahead and replace one of these modified clamps. So the first thing you're going to do is select the area where you're going to section the clamp to make it either a left or a right clamp. So in this particular case, this is the disc that I normally use, and here is the reference. This is a disc made by Comet and sold by Comet. And the reason why I like this disc, and I'll share with you a clinical video so that you can see how I do this, but the reason why I like this disc is because it's very thin and it goes right into the metal and it creates a nice and clean cut. And it's a very thin cut. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to section half of the clamp. So I'm going to section one of the bows of the clamp. If I want to make this my right 212 clamp, I'm going to section the left bow out of the clamp. So right here, you see I'm sectioning one portion, and then I'm going to go ahead and section the other portion. And you can see here, both the bow was sectioned on the lingual and the buccal jaws of the clamp, and this separates this bow from the rest of the clamp. So now this is the initially the first modification that you need to do on this 212 clamp, and that is section the clamp, remove the left bow if you want to make this a right hand clamp, and obviously remove the right hand bow if you want to make this a left clamp. So here are both of the clamps that I showed you at the beginning, and now I have two clinically applicable clamps, one for the left side and one for the right side. Step number 2, you're going to use a silicon carbide abrasive disc, and this one that I'm sharing with you is made by Shofu. And what I use this wheel for, this disc, is just to smooth the areas where I section the clamp. Make sure that everything is nice and round and that you don't leave behind any sharp areas. Once you have done that, the third step is to eliminate the memory within the stainless steel or the metal surrounding the jaws of the clamp. So this is very important step, and the way that you do this, I normally do this using a gas a torch, and obviously I'm going to light up the torch, and once the flame is on, you can see, and again I'm going to show you a video exactly how this is done. But what you do is that you heat up only the jaws. Make sure that the heat or the flame never contacts the bow, because you don't want to weaken or you don't want to eliminate the memory of the bow. You want these clamps to come back together every time you open and close this. You want the jaws, I'm sorry, to come back together every time that you separate or that you open this clamp with your forceps. And that is this approximation of these jaws. Every time you let go of the forceps is given by the memory that is kept on the bow of this clamp. So the only memory that you want to eliminate is the memory, the metal memory that you have on the jaws. And the reason why you want to do that is because once you have eliminated the memory, and I'm going to show you now how you're going to section the clamp in this video. I'm going to share with you all these steps, the first steps that we have already given, we've completed. So first step, again, you're going to section one bow of the clamp, either the left or the right bow, depending on which clamp you want to fabricate first. And you can see with this diamond disc by Comet, very easy, very nice and clean cut. I'm holding the clamp with my hands. There's no heat because it's so quick and fast. Once you've separated the bows, now you have your modified 212 clamp left and right. Now you're going to use your abrasive disc. And again, you're going to smooth out all the sharp areas that were left behind. Just smooth it out so that you have a very nice and round surface where in that area where the connector was that held that bow in place. Again, you can see that I'm going I'm just making everything natural. Now, this is the most important aspect of the video. I want you to look at the jaws, buccal and lingual jaw, and I want you to see how they turn red. You literally have to heat them up until they are red hot. And once they're red hot, you go in really quickly and you put them in cold water. And by doing that, you just eliminated the memory in those jaws. Once I do that, I just go ahead and polish these jaws, and I'm using just a greeny wheel here just to polish, because obviously after heating them up, you're gonna get some stained black marks around the beaks of the jaw. And look how nice you can polish this clamp after you use these greeny wheels. So once you have heated them up, now you know that you have eliminated the memory only in the jaws of the clamp. And what you are now capable of doing, or you're able to do without damaging the clamp, is that you're going to be able to move these beaks either up or down. And what you want to do initially is that you want to make these beaks very nice and parallel. And I'll show you a photo of exactly of what I'm referring to right here. So what you're seeing in this photo, and when I'm doing this procedure, when I'm actually modifying my 212 clamp, I use a dentiform. I'm literally using a dentiform where I have all these plastic teeth. And initially, all I want to do is just get them to kind of fit these teeth. And then any added modification, I'm going to do it intraorally, directly into the, measuring everything directly into the patient that I'm going to be using these clamps on, directly in his mouth. So I want to make sure that I know what the cervical buccal cervical width is of the tooth, and what the lingual anatomy is on the cervical aspect of the tooth. And if I need to do any added modifications, by all means, I will do them right there, chair side, when my patient is in the clinic. But what I want you to see here is that this clamp that you see on the left-hand side, this 212 clamp, I have already made both the lingual and the buccal beaks or jaws more parallel. And I want you to compare this clamp to this other 212 clamp that I have not modified. So the beaks, the angulation of the beaks of this right-hand side 212 clamp are just the way that the company manufactures them. And if you were to see it on this left right-hand photo, you can see the angulation that comes made by the, directly from the factory. What I want to do is I want to make this lingual beak and the buccal beak more parallel one to the other. And I'm going to tell you why this is so important. You see, now I have modified the positions of the beaks of the right hand clamp as well. So these two beaks are now nice and parallel. The lingual beaks and the buccal beaks are nice and parallel one to the other. And the reason why you want to do this is because you don't want these beaks to impinge on the tissue. You want these beaks to always sit on actual tooth structure, because again, these clamps are not retraction clamps anymore. Now they are retentive clamps, and you want to make sure that when you are pushing the clamp apically, you do not damage the tissue, or you do the minimal amount of damage or laceration to the tissue that you possibly can. So now let's look at the clamp on the buccal aspect. And I can share with you, I want you to look at this photo, and I want you to see I've already made this buccal jaw flat with the lingual, or parallel with the lingual. But there's another thing that I want you to look at here. Yes, my beak is nicely seated and supported by the actual tooth structure below this class 5, but look at the width of the beak, and look at the way that the beaks, or the points of the beaks, are actually impinging on the neighboring tissue. So I know that this is going to lacerate my patient's mouth. So what is the next modification? What is the step 5 or the 5th modification that you need to do on these clamps? Using a 245 burr, you now can smooth out and taper the buccal jaws of the 212 clamp. And you are seeing here, I have now tapered this buccal jaw. I have made it narrower so that the points of the jaw do not sit on the actual tissue. The beaks of the buccal jaw are fully seated on the actual tooth structure, and the points of the beak are not impinging on the tissue. Now I know this is a passive clamp. And once you take this clamp to your patient's mouth, if there is any contact of the points with the tissue, all you have to do is grab your 245 burr and chair side, modify just a little bit more until you get this beak to be at the right mesial distal width. So now I want you to look at the lingual side. And this is the lingual beak that has only been flattened to be parallel with the buccal beak, but look at the mesial distal width. And you can see in a close-up photo in my dentiform that the mesial uh, um, point is impinging on the tissue. The same the same as the distal point of my lingual beak is impinging on the tissue, and you can see it right here. So what am I going to do there? I'm going to modify the lingual beak, and the modification of the lingual beak is a little bit different than the buccal beak. One thing that you have to keep in mind to modify the lingual beak is that you want to use this angle. Now, this angle, this is the connector. This angle is the connector of the actual bow with the buccal beak. This angle is the one that you're going to use to transfer this angle to your lingual beak. So the way that you modify your lingual beak is following the anatomy of this clamp. So the buccal beak is going to be nice and round. It's just going to be narrower. The lingual beak is going to have a different anatomy, and the anatomy is going to follow the actual anatomy of this connector that connects the bow with the buccal beak. So you see here, I'm using my 245 to reference this angle. And then I'm going to take my 245 into the lingual beak and make sure that I section the beak following that angle that I just shared with you right now. And when you do that, you can see now that I've eliminated the distal point of the lingual beak. Now it's not impinging on the tissue anymore. And I have narrowed a little bit the mesial beak, so it's literally sitting on the tooth. What this does for us, you can see now that I have more of the surface of the actual lingual beak in contact with the tooth structure. And this is going to prevent this clamp to move either mesial or distal. This will help you stabilize this modified 212 clamp. And that's the way that you section. And again, you can see now I have used the same greeny wheel to polish all the modifications on the buccal beak. I used the greeny wheel to smooth out all the modifications on the lingual beak. And you can see that I was even able to eliminate a little bit the sharpness of the mesial point of the lingual beak. So now this clamp has been fully modified. And as I'm showing you here, you can use this 212 clamp in premolars. You can use it in mandibular or maxillary incisor teeth. You can use it on your canines, and you can even use it on your molars. So this is a very versatile clamp. Once you modify it, you can use it all over the patient's mouth. So again, if by all means, if by any chance you don't have a B4 clamp or a W00 clamp, you can use your modified 212 clamp. Now, I would not recommend you eliminating the B4 clamp and the W00 because again, I showed you and demonstrated to you how useful they are for many clinical cases, but I would definitely recommend that you add a modified 212 to your armamentarium because this is going to give you now the possibility or the opportunity to go more distal than your premolars, going more towards the molar area. And again, in some cases where you have some recession on the molar areas, you are even going to be able to use two W212 clamps, one on the mesial aspect and one on the distal aspect of your molar if needed for better access in regards to your preparations. So now I'm going to share with you some clinical cases where these clamps have been used, the modified 212, so that you can see how, again, how can you incorporate this into your clinical practice. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to cement an indirect restoration on this remaining tooth structure. And you can see here, I'm using my modified 212 clamp. I've modified the buccal and the lingual beaks. They are very nice and stable, and they are so stable that I did not have any need to add any blockout resin or any compound to my clamp to have some added stabilization. But at the same time, I want you to see how nicely this clamp pushes or retracts the rubber dam and the tissue and allows the rubber dam to invert itself very nicely on this distal margin that we can all agree that is a lot deeper than the mesial margin of my preparation. Now, again, in many of these clinical situations, you are going to need to add a Teflon tape and I just roll up a little bit of Teflon tape and push it against the rubber dam so that I can seal some areas that may stay a little bit open, like you're seeing right here. If I want to just push the rubber dam out of the way, if I want to separate the rubber dam in any specific area, I do that by using Teflon tape. And you can see that I have a little bit here on the buckle, and there's a little bit more here on the lingual that has helped me all the way through the distal to the mesial area, of this margin, that has allowed me to push that rubber dam apically and expose my margin completely prior to cleaning of the tooth structure and acid etching of my margins for delivery of an indirect restoration. So I have full control of the operative field, and that control is thanks to my modified 212 clamp. Now, in this other case that I'm going to share with you is a crown preparation case. And again, I want you to see right here, this is the modified 212 clamp. This is a central incisor. And because we're going to remove this crown with using a burn, we're going to prep this tooth. I want you to see here, I'm using a Teflon tape to push the rubber dam, to separate the rubber dam from the actual prosthetic margin that I need access to. And you can see here, the Teflon tape is rolled and pushed into place. And again, when you start doing this, you're going to notice that, putting this Teflon tape in this space between the tooth and the rubber dam is not as easy as it may appear to be here in the photo. But again, it all requires is just a little bit of practice. And once you get the hang of it, you will most likely be very successful in this technique. Now you are seeing here a cotton plier that is helping us keep this Teflon tape in place, and then the cord packer. Make sure that your cord packer is a nice and smooth and round end cord packer. No serrated cord packers can be used for this technique, because what you don't need to damage the Teflon. All you need to do is push it underneath the rubber dam, separate the rubber dam from the margin, so now you can have access with the burr and avoid damaging your rubber dam while you're going in, removing the crown and prepping the tooth. And again, you can see here, you can go around the whole margin. These two, you can see the Teflon tape here, just pushing the rubber dam away so that it can give you full access with your burrs. Again, all these techniques do require obviously some practice. So you will, if you've never done this before, you will get better at it the more you use it. Again, this is now another tooth, a lateral incisor. You can see how broken down the tooth is. Now you see this buccal jaw is thinner than the buccal jaw of the clamp that you saw on tooth number on the central incisor. So we added some more modification to this clamp. We made it thinner here, mesiodistally, so that it actually engages well without damaging the tissue around this tooth. Now we're going to put the Teflon around the margins to just push the rubber dam out of the way. And you can see here an incisal view of the clamp. Very nice, pushing all the rubber dam out of the way. The Teflon tape is helping us separate the rubber dam. Now you can start removing the crown, getting into the area where the decay was. You have full control of the operative field. You know that you have a root canal. There's an extensive damage on this tooth. You know that you're going to need to place a pose and build up a core. So all that can be done in that same clinical appointment, because you have really good isolation. You have complete control of your operative field, and your clamp is very nice and stable thanks to the added stability that is given here by the blockout resin. So this is my last slide, and now I'm going to open my presentation to any questions you may have.